everyone, Ryan here from Home Mechanics. Recently saw that my sister's 2015 Honda Civic had its brakes worn down pretty far. They were squeaking pretty bad, and so I told her if she'd bring it over, I'd swap them out for her. Figured I'd shoot a quick tutorial for all of you that may have a similar job that you need to do. This will work for most Honda vehicles. It's a very similar process. So I'll write down in the description below which vehicles use the exact same pads and follow the same process. So even if your vehicle is not a Honda Civic, if it is a Honda or even an Acura, this will be a very similar process. So if you've got some common hand tools, this is a really easy job. And if you've got any questions, shoot them in the comments below, and I'm usually pretty quick to respond. Okay, so here's everything I needed to get the job done. So first I had jack and jack stands, the JIS, screwdriver bit, some eye protection, a wire brush, C-clamp, ratchet with a 12mm, and then a small sledge, breaker bar with an 11/16, and then I also used a 3/4. And then I had my torque wrenches, obviously to torque everything back down. As far as liquids and lubricants, I had my just brake lubricant, and then some brake clean, anti-seize, PB blaster. Obviously you'll need the brakes, and then some shop towels. And that was all I used to do this job. So if you have some of these common hand tools, you'll be able to do this job as well. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is to take the lug nuts just a little bit of the way off while the tire's on the ground, because once you get it up in the air, it'll spin. So get the lug nuts just a little bit of the way off, and then you're gonna consult your owner's manual to make sure you've got the proper lift point. And then I like to lift to the middle when I can, otherwise you can lift from the sides. And then you'll get it lifted up, and we're gonna put the car on jack stands. Okay, once you get the vehicle lifted, you'll wanna place a jack stand underneath. Never just leave the lift as on your lift point. That can be pretty dangerous. So make sure that it's on a jack stand. And then I always like to just shake the vehicle a little bit to make sure that it's on there squarely and it feels like it is. And then also don't forget to chalk off your wheels on the back as well, just for added safety. Then you can just use your breaker bar to loosen the nuts and then twist them the rest of the way off by hand. And then just for a little added safety and a little bit extra peace of mind, it's always nice to just put the tire that you've just taken off underneath the car, just to make sure that it's got an extra point to fall on before it falls on you. Okay, so once you've got your tire off, the next step is going to be to get your brake caliper off. So this is the brake caliper right here. It's a couple pieces. This is like a clamshell, and it'll open up. And if you're just doing the brake pads, you really only need to take off this portion right here, which is the clamshell portion of it. But I'm going to get these rotors resurfaced, and so I'm going to take this part off. I'm going to take the whole caliper off. So I'll show you how to get that off. And then I'm going to take these rotors over to just a local auto parts store to have them resurface them. That's the best way to get a complete brake job done, is to get these resurfaced if you're not going to put on new rotors. That'll just keep your brake pads, give them a little bit more time, and they won't suffer as much wear and tear after you put brand new brake pads on. So working on cars can be hard enough sometimes, so it's always nice to have little tips and tricks that can help you to make this a little bit easier. So one of those is that if you turn your wheel over to the side that you're working on, it opens up a lot more space, and it's going to be a lot easier to get back in here with a breaker bar or whatever you need to remove the bolts. So always make sure to turn the vehicle and work with the vehicle versus having to kind of dig back in there and not have room for some of your tools. This little tip will just help make the job a whole lot easier. Okay, so in order to get this caliper off, there's 4 bolts. There's 2 that are for the clamshell, so here's one right there, and then there's another one just right up here. And if you take those off, the ones that have these rubber boots on them, you can just take the clamshell off with that. And if you're just doing the brake pads, that's all you'll need. But if you want to take the whole caliper off, then back here there's another large one, and then there's another one up here that you can see. And these you'll have to take off as well if you want to take the whole caliper off. Okay, so these caliper bolts are on the top and on the bottom are 12 millimeters. So you can just get your ratchet in here and just give it a twist, and they should break open, break loose. Then you can just twist them the rest of the way off. So you'll need to get the top and the bottom. If they're really stuck on there, you can spray a little bit of PB Blaster in there to get them to loosen up a little bit. Some of you may have like more rust on yours. They may be a little bit tough because they're rust welded. But if you just do that and you take both of these and just give them a good twist. It's not a bad idea as you're going along to have a place to keep all your bolts and lug nuts and everything together so you don't lose them, because that's kind of annoying. So if you have a bowl or a cup, that's probably even better, but I just kind of set mine in groups aside. And then for these larger ones back here, I'm going to use an 11/16 to get these off, and I've got my larger breaker bar on here. So this should just be a little bit easier to get something that's usually pretty stuck, is if you have a little bit more leverage. And once you get them off just a little bit, then they should twist the rest of the way. Again, if you need some help, you can get some PB Blaster and let it soak there for a little bit. You know, that penetrating oil gets in there and it usually makes these things a lot easier to break off. Okay, and then once you've got all 4 of those caliper bolts off, this should just slide right out. And then you never want to leave this caliper just dangling. It's connected to the brake line that you can see back here, and if you leave it dangling, it's going to damage your brake line. So always make sure that it's set up. You know, you can set it up here on top of the rotor. You can get a bungee cord and you know, connect it or tie it to something so that it's not just left hanging. The goal here is just to make sure that it's not hanging out all on its own. Okay, so once you have this guy out, you're gonna just separate the caliper parts so that you've got your portion with the brake pads here that comes out, and then the rest of the caliper you're gonna leave sitting up here. Like I said, you wanna make sure that it's just sitting somewhere that it's not gonna dangle. So I'm gonna set mine right there on the rotor for now. I'm gonna have to move it once I take the rotor off. But for right now, I'll just set it up there. Make sure the brake line isn't pinched, it's not hanging. That'll just, you know, keep you from having to do a much larger job of replacing your brake line. Okay, so you can see the brake hardware here in the caliper. We're just gonna pop these out. They slide out real easy once you've got this out. So we'll take that out. We're gonna replace all the brake hardware. So you can see right here on the top and on the bottom, there's this brake hardware. We don't ever want to reuse this, so we'll pop that out. And then this is, we'll just set this aside for the time being. Okay, so everyone's got their brake pad of choice. Because I do these jobs myself, I always get a higher cost brake pad. They last longer, they're quieter, better stopping power. So I'd recommend just spending a few extra dollars and getting a more premium brake pad if you're gonna do this yourself. But when you pop open the box, you'll see you've got your hardware here. So again, we never reuse the hardware. So use the hardware that comes with the box. And then we have, we'll have the matching brake pads. They always come in sets of the 4 pads, 2 for each wheel. And you'll see that they just match up there. And so these are the new pads, just to compare with the old pad. So you can see here how worn down one is versus the other. So this kind of tells you that the pad needs to be replaced. If we measured this out, this would measure below standard and I guess safety levels. And so this pad on the bottom, you know, they're designed to squeak when they get too low. And so this has hit the point where it's squeaking. And so that's when you know it's time to replace your brake pad. In the brakes that I always buy is some synthetic brake lubricant. If you don't have some of this in your box, you're going to want to buy some because we're going to need this to lubricate the boot that goes around the caliper bolt. And so make sure that you've got some of this. If you don't have some in your box, then you can go buy some at your local auto parts store or online. And then again, just because of all the brake dust and buildup that gets on the caliper, I just like to run a brush over it to get it all cleaned up nice. Get a lot of that buildup and dust off of the caliper bracket. This is something that you may not get if you pay to get your brakes done, but I just, when I do a job, I want to make sure that it is done all the way. And then I like to get some brake clean and just spray it onto my shop towel and rub it down. The reason I do it, I don't want to spray it directly on, is that I don't want to get it on the boot and dry out the boot here on the caliper. And so then I'm just going to rub this all down with the brake clean, get it cleaned up. Maybe just a little more towel. And then this is a lot cleaner than it was when I started. Get some of that buildup off, and that's less chance that you're going to get squeaks and dirt going into your brakes that'll cause squeaks outside of just the brake pad wearing down. Okay, so once you've got this caliper bracket out, you want to take the caliper guide pins out. There's one on each side, and just be careful not to rip your boot. Just want to twist them a little bit and they'll come out. And I'm going to get a paper towel and just clean off the old lubricant that was on the caliper guide pin. One. And then there's two. And then take the new lubricant and I'm just going to add a little bit in here, and then just kind of rub it around the guide pin. Doesn't take too much, just enough. You want to make sure to use lubricant and not anti-seize or something else, because that'll wear out the boot right here. And then you just want to kind of bounce this in back and forth a little bit, and then we'll do the same thing on this side. Just get a little lubricant on here, and then again just pop it in. Make sure that it's seated all the way at the bottom of the boot so that it covers. And then same thing, just give it a few twists and turns, bounce it up and down. And then your new your caliper guide bolts are in place and lubricated and ready to go. The other good thing about scrubbing everything down is that it's going to make it easier for your brake hardware to seat. And so you're going to get your new brake hardware out of the box and just pop it in, make sure that it's seated properly. If it's not seated all the way on, it's going to make it harder for you to get your brake pads in, and they won't fit properly. So it's just important to make sure that you get these seated really well against the caliper bracket. And we're all set. Then if we just get in here close, I want to show you what it looks like when it's seated properly. So you shouldn't see any gaps right here as you're looking at your hardware. There shouldn't be any gaps in between. That's just going to make sure that you have enough space to get the brakes in. So you can see that it's pretty well seated on there. And before you put your brake pads on, I like to get some of this anti-seize and apply just a little bit. You can use lubricant if that's what you've got, but this anti-seize is going to last longer and it's not going to break down in the heat. This is meant to stand up in the serious heat that your brakes generate. You're just going to add a tiny bit to the metal right here, and really, not a ton, But this metal on metal contact that's going to happen between the pads and the hardware, it's going to make that a lot easier with this anti-seize. So I'm going to add a little bit just to the tops here where the connection is going to be made. And then I'll do it to both pads. And then you see the curve here, so you're going to want to match your pads up with that curve. And so the same way that that's curving, you want your pads to curve that way. And then just slide them in. Try not to get any anti-seize on the brake pad or the rotor as you're doing this, and if you do, make sure you wipe it off. And then because these are seated well, that should slide in pretty well. And then we'll just flip this over. And then as you're putting these brake pads back in, just make sure that the one side has this part that sticks out and then it goes on the inside. If it goes on the outside, it won't be able to fit correctly. So just make sure that it goes on that way. Okay, so the next step is to remove the rotors if you're going to do this. I'm going to take these in to get them resurfaced. So some of you may come in here and see that you need to get these 2 bolts out before you can get the rotors off. Quick tip, so these are not for Phillips screwdrivers. If you use a Phillips screwdriver, you will strip it. It's going to ruin your day. Don't use a Phillips. You want to use one of the JIS screwdriver tips. So make sure you have a JIS screwdriver. That stands for like Japanese something screwdriver. I can't remember. But you can see that the tips here are different. One's a lot thicker, and when you put it in, you'll notice that it fits really cleanly, and you'll be able to take it off with a little bit of effort. And with the Phillips, it looks like it fits in there, and you'd be able to twist it maybe, but with how tight these are, you're just going to end up stripping it. So please don't use a typical Phillips head versus the JIS head. If you have an impact drill, it'll make this a little bit easier. You can just stick the JIS head in there and give it a little spin, and it'll pop right out. That's the easiest way. You may have to use a little bit of elbow grease to be able to get it off if you don't have one. And then even once you get those off, sometimes you may just have it be rust welded on there, a little bit stuck. So there's a few different tricks that you can use to get it off at that point. So if your rotor's stuck on and you need to get it off, if you're not going to reuse it, you can just give it a few whacks with like a small sledge. Because I want to reuse this, I'm going to make sure to hit it on the back here with a wood block, just so it distributes the force and it doesn't put any dents. You don't want to have any dents in your rotor. So just make sure that you've got something to kind of block some of that blow. You may even try a rubber mallet if you've got one of those, but that may not do the job completely. But then once you've given it a few whacks, this should just slide right off. And then you're all set with one of your rotors. And then I just like to take my wire brush and scrub the surface here around the lug nut studs, just to clean up all the brake residue and make sure that it's ready for the new rotor or the rotor that's been resurfaced. And then just grab a little bit of brake clean. I like the 3M brake clean, and just spray down the surface after you're done scrubbing it. Once everything's clean, you're good to put the rotor back on. Just make sure that everything lines up with the right bolt holes, and then you can screw those JIS screws back in to hold your rotor into place. Okay, so as we're getting this set on, we just want to make sure that these holes right here match up with the ones in the back. And so we'll take this and slide it on, and then you'll want to get one of your bolts and just thread it into the back to hold this on, and then you can clamp the brake pads just onto the rotor. You can flush them up against it. So I'm just going to thread this here into the back. I know that it's in the right spot because it's going right in. And then, so there's one that is in, hand tight, and then I'll just do the other one. And then before I throw my clamshell back on, I like to stick just a little bit of anti-seize on the outside of this brake pad. I'll wipe that up in just a minute. But just a little bit here where the metal is going to be touching the metal. Not a whole lot. I'm just going to dip it in once. Just kind of smooth this out. And then I'll come over here and do the other side. And this is just to prevent squeaking. And then one of the last steps is going to be to push this brake piston back into the caliper. It's actually a lot easier than that might sound. So when you push on your brakes, this piston is pushing out and is what squeezes. And as your brakes wear down, it moves farther and farther in so that it can continue to squeeze your brakes as the brake fluid compresses and then pushes on the piston, which then closes over your brake pads. And so right now, because we put new brake pads on, this has to go back in order to fit over the new brake pads. But you can see right here, pull this boot back a little bit, this is really dirty, and so I don't want to push that back in to the boot here without cleaning it off. So again, I don't want to spray brake clean on the boot to wear it out, and so I'm going to put some on a paper towel and then just clean around the outside of this piston ring right there. You can see how much cleaner that is now. And so now I feel a lot more comfortable pushing that back in so that it doesn't contaminate my brake fluid. And then before you push these back in, you want to get in here and check out your brake fluid. So I opened up this cap and looked, and I know that this one's actually pretty full because I just topped it off for my sister a little bit ago. And so before I go ahead and move the piston back in, I want to make sure to take out some of this brake fluid. Otherwise, it's going to start pushing brake fluid up out and spill over the car, and that's never any fun. So the best way to get this out is if you can just use a turkey baster to just kind of squeeze it in there and then suck it all out. But I don't have one, so I'm going to use a less elegant method of just scooping some out with a spoon, a plastic spoon, and then tossing everything. You really don't want to mess with this brake fluid. Use gloves because it's not really good for you. Okay, so to compress this back in, there's a couple different ways to do it. I personally don't have a brake pad spreader tool. I can link to one in the description if you don't have a C-clamp. But if you just have a C-clamp like me, you can fit this over, and I've done it this way every single time. Just fit this over and then start tightening it, and then I put the old brake pad up against the piston, and then as I turn here and tighten it up, you're going to see that this will start compressing it in. And then it's almost all the way back in. This is really easy. I don't have to push very hard. And there you go. It's all the way back in. So that pushes back in really easy. You shouldn't have to force it. And then this will just go over the top. And we're going to fit it right back on over the top of the brake pads. Make sure that your brake line is not twisted at all. So mine was twisted just a little bit. Make sure that it's not twisted, and then this will slide right back over the top. And then I'm just going to get my caliper guide pin bolts, and these are going to slide in, and then I'm just going to hand tighten them down. So right there. And then remember there's another one down below right here. And so I'm just gonna put this one back in and make sure that they are sitting nice and flush. And then those are hand tightened in, and then everything is just hand tight. And now I'm gonna torque it down. Okay, so now you just need to torque everything into place. Whatever you do, do not over torque these, especially these ones up top, because they'll break off in your caliper bolt, and then you gotta go find a new caliper bolt, and that's no fun. So again, 12 millimeter, and then you're just gonna torque them down. This one, these ones, the caliper bolts, the caliper guide pin bolts, they get 17 foot-pounds of torque. And then the larger ones in the back that mount this caliper bracket, they get 80 foot-pounds of torque. So make sure to use those torque specs when torquing these back into place. Okay, so once you're torqued down to 80 foot-pounds of torque on the back caliper bracket bolts, and then on these caliper guide pin bolts at 17 foot-pounds of torque, then you're all set. You can throw the wheel back on and then do the other side. You'll just repeat all these exact same steps back over on the other wheel. Make sure that you're doing this in pairs and that you're not just doing one side. You want both sides to be done. Even if they wore a little bit unevenly, you want to make sure that both sides are done at the same time and always done in pairs. And once you've got everything put back together, the wheels back on, and your car is on the ground, you're gonna pump the brake a few times until you feel it start to tighten. It'll feel really loose when you first pump it, but it should get tighter as you continue to pump. Okay, so once everything's back in, you want to get out on the road and just do a little driving. And when you're out, you want to get going about 40 miles an hour and go against instinct and kind of hit your brakes a little bit hard. Stop quicker than you would, so that you can start to break the brake pads in. Obviously, test everything first to make sure that it's working. But you want to do this a few times where you're going kind of fast, maybe 40 miles an hour, and you come to a quick stop, and that's going to break your brake pads in to the new, I guess your new brake pads into the rotor. So do that probably 5 or 6 times, get your brake pads nice and hot, and then that should get them broken into the rotor. Hopefully that video was helpful for you. If you've got any questions, again, put them in the comments. If it was helpful, give it a like, give me a subscribe. I just noticed that her rear brakes also need to be replaced, and so that video will be coming soon. If you hit subscribe, then you'll see when that video comes out. Likely if you've got your front ones that are worn down, your rear ones aren't far behind. So if you do need some help there, again, I'm quick to answer comments, and if you follow, you'll get more content on the Honda and other vehicles.